Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and today I want to talk to you about automation. Automation is essentially telling GarageBand to tell your mix what to do at individual moments, to tell one track to turn up or to pan off to the left, or your reverb to turn down. It's a really powerful tool, and it works for you if done correctly, but can really work against you if it's done incorrectly. I would actually say that the number one problem I've seen in a lot of my students' early mixes is automating too much and automating too early. In nearly every case, you don't need to automate anything until the very end of your mixing process. And before we get into today's video, if you're like, well, what is the end of the mixing process? How do I know when I'm approaching the end of the mixing process? Well, I want to make it really easy for you. I put together a 6-step checklist that walks through the 6 steps that all professional mixes have and how you can do them inside GarageBand completely free. There's a link in the description below where you can grab that, so be sure to pick that up. It's really going to help you out. Automation is the 6th and final step of the mixing process, and by knowing that you've worked through all of the other 5, you can confidently know that it's an okay time to start doing automation, and that automation is going to be working for you as opposed to potentially working against you. So let's go and jump into today's video. Let's start by talking about the 2 ways that you might be hurting yourself if you automate too early. The first is that you lose easy tweakability. And by tweakability, what I really mean is perfecting your volumes over the first 5 stages of your mix. So when you're going through the mixing process, you initially set a static mix, set all of your volume levels. And as you work through the other stages, your master track processing and your EQ and your compression and setting your other effects, you might realize like, oh, this volume on this lead vocal is just a little bit too loud or just a little bit too quiet. And so if you haven't done any automation, then you could just grab this volume fader and pull it up just a little bit or down just a little bit. You can play with it, make sure that it's really sitting at the right level. But after you've automated, look what happens.
Alone and to travel, but she's so far from home and she kinda unraveled.
Nope. It's not going to work, because now, as opposed to this volume slider telling this volume where to be, all of these little dots and lines in here are telling this volume slider where to be. And that's not going to make it easy for me to just perfect that, right? I could grab and select all of these automation points and bring them all down a little bit. But 1, it's hard to really get precise with that. And 2, if I want to play with it and maybe try it up a little bit and then maybe try it down a little bit, I can't easily quickly do that. So keeping that easy tweakability throughout the entire mixing process is really helpful. The second way you might be hurting yourself is that you don't actually necessarily know what your final audio is going to sound like if you automate at the very beginning or early on in the mixing process. And that's because one of the main ways that we process audio during the mixing process is compression. And what compression is doing is it's reducing the dynamic range of your tracks in a very easy, fast, natural sounding way. And so, for example, if we zoom in here on this section of this track, you'll see we haven't done any automation. Let me go back to just the audio. We haven't done any automation here, but you might think, okay, well, this line is clearly a little bit louder than this line. So maybe I need to draw some automation in to turn up this word and turn down this word so that they'll sound closer in volume. Or if you just have an entire phrase that looks louder, like this whole phrase looks louder than this phrase, you might think, okay, well, I'm going to automate down the volume here and automate up the volume here. But you might not need to do that. We can see here, I didn't feel like we needed to do that when I heard the final audio, because if you pull up your compressor, you can see this is going to be turning down the volume at different points depending on how loud it is. So if we listen to this lead vocal here and watch this and notice how it turns down more on louder words and less on quieter words.
She came to work on a short-term visa. She never meant to leave with her heart in pieces.
It's making a billion little adjustments there to keep this volume sounding really balanced in a way that if I were to do that with automation, 1, it would take forever, and 2, it would be really unnatural sounding most likely, because I'm doing it by sight. I'm not necessarily going to be able to do it easily and quickly by my ears. It's just not going to be as natural sounding as a tool that was literally designed for that purpose. But that doesn't mean that your automation is never going to fix that problem. So you can see here, we've used automation at different points to make sure that, this line, for some reason, this one word seemed a little bit louder in the context of the mix as I was getting near at the end of the mixing process. And that's when you really want to be making this kind of automation decision. Once you know the compression is not necessarily addressing this one word, then you go in and you automate it. And that takes us perfectly into the three main goals for automating. The first goal is to make sure everything can be heard clearly. That means that both it is loud enough and that it also isn't too loud. So for example, in this line here, we're starting to bring up the volume here because this phrase starts to get a little bit quiet, and then this phrase we want to really add a little bit of impact to, and he starts to really trail off here. So I just have it slowly increasing in volume throughout this whole phrase, but this one word really started to jump out too much. So listen to that in the context of the mix.
She's so far from home and she kinda unraveled, all the while in the dangers of an American smile. She said, I wish you.
Right? So we're using automation to make sure that all of that can be heard really, really clearly. In this case, it's not as much about this section is literally louder or quieter. It's just that in the context of this mix, we want this vocal to be a little bit louder at this point in the song. We want it to jump out a little bit more. And you have to make that decision near the end of the mix. And so I went through the entire mix and just listened to the entire vocal, focusing on the vocal and making sure that every word was really clear, that every phrase was really clear, that it felt right in the context of the mix. Sometimes it's okay for a line to trail off if it feels right, but you don't want it to trail off if it doesn't feel right. So sometimes you want to turn up the volume so that it gets louder through that section in the context of the mix. Another way we did this is we have this little musical break here, and I brought up the violin at different key points to make sure that it was really highlighted in the context right here.
For her.
Nothing crazy, but it really just helps that violin cut through a little bit better. And at the same time, this transitions perfectly into the second goal with automation, which is to reduce distractions. So when I was bringing up this lead violin part, so that it was really the focus of the song, I also had this mandolin getting a little bit loud at a couple points in a way that I felt was distracting. So I use automation here to bring it down at a couple key points so that it never jumps out over the violin. And then at the same time, I also brought it up right here to make sure it can be heard clearly when it's doing this cool little flourish. So subtle things, but by turning down this little section in the middle, it just doesn't distract. It doesn't pull your ear off towards it when I want your ear to be focusing in on that violin. And then other ways that we could reduce distractions, for example, this backing vocal here was just a little loud as everything kind of got quieter in this section, this harmony.
And it was falling for her, it was spring, and she said not to call, don't give me a ring.
So instead of letting it just be up and kind of distract from the lead vocal, I turn it down just a little bit for just that one phrase. And then other ways is effect automation. So if you saw my last video on how I make lead vocal effects, stacking lead vocal effects, I talk about creating slap delays and plate delays on separate tracks where I've duplicated the lead vocal. So one great thing that allows me to do is easily automate those vocal effects at different points in the song. So that's one of my favorite things to do to make sure that it fits appropriately. You know, in a verse, you often have a little bit less going on than in your big, thick, full chorus sound. So in the verses, I might need a little less reverb. So you can see throughout, if I zoom out on this mix, throughout this mix, the lead vocal reverb here, it turns down in all the verses and up a little bit in all the choruses. Not a huge amount, just a little bit, just so that the vocal feels a little bit more present in the verses. Check this out here. I'll zoom in here. Listen to how this transitions across from into this verse into the chorus with these effects on and off. So I bring this slap delay way down here. I already have the reverb down a little bit, and then as it transitions into the chorus, notice how the vocal just takes up a little bit more sonic space and feels a little bit more distant.
And she kinda unraveled, all the while in the dangers of an American smile. She said, I wish you were here and you will be next time.
It's subtle, right? But these subtle things add up to a really clean professional sound. And by turning this slapback delay down on this one particular line, while also automating up this lead vocal a little bit, I really drive home that line. I make it feel really present and really forward in the context of the mix. So if we listen to that here.
All the while in the dangers of an American smile. She said, I wish you were here.
And so I get to have the best of both worlds. I get to have these big effects in the choruses and not overwhelming effects in the verses. You know, if we have this at the chorus level, so these are up at chorus volumes, and I turn off automation, listen to how out of place this reverb and slapback delay sound at the start of this song.
He fell in love with the postcard. It made him cry in the backyard. He read it by the hedges.
It's not crazy, but compared to when you tuck them down in just a little bit more.
He fell in love with the postcard. It made him cry in the backyard. He read it by the hedges.
That feels a lot better to me, a lot more natural, a lot more where I want that reverb to be than when it's at the chorus volume. So it's a subtle thing, but it really adds up and helps the vocal cut through in the right way. And that takes me to our third main goal, which is to add interest for the listener. So there's several ways that you can accomplish this across your mix. I think effect automation is a huge one. I think that's really important. Another thing is to automate different other elements throughout the song. So for example, there's backing vocals throughout this entire song, but they don't necessarily need to be at one static volume the entire time. So in the chorus, these backing vocals are pretty loud. Let me solo some of these here.
Will be next time.
Pretty loud, you know, in the context of the mix.
I faced all my fears and love is all I need.
But I don't necessarily want those to be that prominent at other points in the song. So in the verses, I have them turned down quite a bit. So if we go up here.
For him it was fall and for her it was spring, and she said not to call.
They're down at a volume where you don't necessarily even notice that they're there. They're just kind of supporting the lead vocal. And then they continue to turn up over the verses, so that by the time it gets to the chorus, they're a little bit more prominent, a little bit more forward.
Don't give me a ring.
Compared to as we transition here.
The last time they can never explain. She said, I wish you were here and you will be.
It's subtle, but it adds more interest for the listener. Another way that I did it is I have these oohs in this final chorus kind of automating up throughout the song. So they're quieter at the start of this chorus and then automating up to the end of the chorus. So they just continue to fill out that final chorus. And then the last thing I did is very, very subtle automation on my master track. So my master track controls the volume for all of the channels running together. So this is kind of like your master volume. And what I do is I turn it down just a little bit in the second and third verses here, so that as you go into the last chorus, it feels a little bit bigger. So it's 1 decibel quieter in this verse than it is in this chorus as a whole. The whole mix turns down 1 decibel. It's very subtle, but it just makes that final chorus feel a little bit bigger than if they were at the same volume, if I didn't automate the master track. So subtle things, but it adds up across your mix. So by waiting to automate, I was able to not lose my tweakability, continue to perfect my volumes across the mix as I'm working through the other 5 steps of the mixing process. And I actually knew what my audio would sound like so that I could do key automations to make sure that it would actually sound the way I wanted it to when I finished the mix. And with that, I was able to make sure everything could be heard clearly, reduce distractions, and add interest for the listener throughout the entire mix. So it didn't feel static, so it felt really alive. If you do this, then it's just like sprinkling a little bit on top of your mix, right? These are all subtle things, but again, mixing is subtle things. So the same way you want to do subtle EQ and subtle compression, you also want to do subtle automation. But if you do it throughout your mix, it's just going to level your mix up a little bit. So definitely don't be afraid of automation, but save it for the end. And as I said, if you don't already have it, be sure to grab my 6-step checklist to a pro mix in GarageBand. That's really going to help you get more professional final mix and know when you can automate in a way that's not going to end up hurting you more than it is helping you. Now, before we go, I want to hear from you. What are some of your favorite automation moves? In this video, we mostly just talked about volume automation, but you can automate just about anything in GarageBand. Let me know in the comments below. If this video was helpful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.
One thing at a time.